Hi, my name is Karina Akidal. I'm the managing editor of Canadian Auto Dealer, and I'm here with Lilian Lau, VP of Marketing at Trader. Now, Lilian, I understand that the company released a new survey in January about buying intentions for consumers, and it's been compared to your March 2020 survey, I believe. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that survey and any key findings that really popped up.
Yeah, absolutely. So just in regards to this survey, as we were approaching the 1-year mark since COVID-19 became an issue here in Canada, we wanted to check in on a pulse for the consumer sentiment and also get a sense of how 2021 would shape. So as you mentioned, we did do the survey back in March 2020, so we have a way to compare it. And we reran this in January. So we surveyed over 3,000 Canadians to identify 300 in-market car shoppers that planned on buying a car in the next 6 months. And the results are very positive in terms of an automotive outlook for 2021. Some of the key insights that we found is throughout the pandemic, the intention to buy has actually remained fairly stable. So between 16 to 18% of Canadians said that they plan on buying a car in the next 6 months. What we are at right now in January is about 17%. So we know that Canadians are looking for cars and they're shopping for cars. We also asked Canadians, what are the top sources of information you're looking for when you're shopping for a used car? And the top cited information were online marketplaces at 57%, dealership websites at 32%, and OEM websites at 39%. That wasn't surprising that online resources were a big source of information for consumers. Also, unsurprisingly, in-person activities have really started to decline. So, things like going to visit a dealership in person, even interacting with friends or family, those numbers are much lower than before the pandemic. So one thing I also didn't mention is we, coincidentally enough, in February 2020, ran a survey on how consumers shop for cars. So fortunately, as fortunate as you can be, we had a baseline that was pre-COVID versus post-COVID. So we're also able to compare how people were changing their shopping behaviors. And we saw post-COVID that in-person activities were declining.
So there's some changes, not many, but is this cause for concern in any way for dealers this year?
Absolutely not. And I'll tell you why. There was another really interesting finding in our survey. So one of the questions we asked, especially when COVID first, became an issue here in Canada, was, do you, are you concerned about the pandemic? Do you think the situation is getting better or worse? Early in the pandemic, a lot of people were very concerned about it, right? It was uncertain. People didn't know what was going on. Lots of new information. And a lot of people thought that the pandemic was getting worse. Over time, into the summer of 2020, that feeling of concern started to decrease. So people were starting to feel better. Once fall, came and into winter and things started to get a little bit more restrictive again, that concern started to grow. So we saw a fluctuation in what people were saying was a concern. However, on the flip side, consumers were not feeling as badly about things tied to the economy. They were feeling actually pretty positive on their personal finances. And they also found, their ability to purchase the car and the affordability to do so improving. So while the sentiment around COVID-19 was fluctuating, getting worse at times, the general trend in how consumers felt about car buying and the economy was actually getting better. So some stats for you that might be interesting. We asked back in March whether or not shoppers would consider delaying their car purchase. And 68% of consumers at the time said in March, yeah, we would consider delaying our car purchase as a result of the pandemic. That's dropped 20 points. Now that's only 48%. We also asked consumers whether they were nervous about being able to afford a vehicle due to the pandemic. And again, back in March 2020, that was 56%, and that's now dropped to 38%. So I think there's a resilience to how consumers are feeling about cars that is starting to be a bit more separate from how the pandemic sentiment has been.
Well, I'm actually curious to know, out of this survey, the one in January, what was the most surprising fact that you found? Was it what you just mentioned? Was it something else perhaps?
The most surprising thing that we found actually was We asked consumers as well, when you're looking at the triggers, like why are you buying a vehicle? One of the things that we initially believed as a result of the pandemic is that maybe the trigger to purchase a vehicle would become a necessity. You know, maybe it'd be more about function and necessity. So people would be buying cars because they absolutely needed a car at that point in time. What's been surprising and very positive is that what people tell us their triggers are not about necessity. They just really want to have that car. So, 30% of the consumers say, they're considering to purchase a vehicle just due to the current vehicle age. Now, we didn't define exactly that it's necessarily an old vehicle. It's just that they're ready to move on to that next vehicle. And a quarter of the respondents said that ultimately they just want to upgrade to something newer and nice. So what's really nice is that the pandemic hasn't really impacted how consumers and why consumers shop. And those two top triggers line up very closely. In fact, they are the same as they were back in February 2020, before the pandemic. So that was what was surprising, is that ultimately, the pandemic hasn't really impacted consumer attitudes and behaviors around cars as much as we may have thought, way back when.
Now, do you see any shifts coming up this year? Any changes to this? Could it change throughout the year? I mean, there could be more lockdowns, curfews, or it could improve. Like, what do you foresee coming up?
I think what we've seen throughout the research that we've been running, because we've been doing this continuously, is that consumer sentiment has just continued to improve. Part of that, I think, is as we've been living through this, it becomes something that's less unfamiliar. So I do believe that consumer sentiment will continue to improve, and that is my hope. But that's why we'll continue to measure the research. In terms of the trends, it's very heartening to see that consumers are continuing to shop for cars. And, as we mentioned earlier, shopping online is really important. That is going to continue to be, a source of information for consumers. And I believe that will continue even, after the pandemic. So online shopping is just really important. We've seen that at AutoTrader. So, our traffic from 2020 versus 2019 grew 21%. And we had 25 million visits like in one single month. So we're seeing consumers actively looking for cars. And it's important, because consumers are looking for those online experiences, for dealers to offer those online experiences as well.
Now, I imagine there's another survey coming up, or several this year. When is the next one coming out, and what will that one cover?
One of the important things about our surveys is that we are trying to always measure trends, so seeing if things are changing. So the survey itself will cover very similar concepts that we've talked about today. What will be very interesting, though, is to see if any of those trends have changed. So it'll be an interesting update in regards to how consumers are feeling about, the pandemic itself, and how they're feeling about car buying.
Okay, I guess my last question for you is, do you have any additional advice to offer, or parting comments that you want to leave with dealers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important thing, as we talk about, is really that online experience for consumers. Because consumers, want to shop online, it's important to offer really good experiences. So for dealers, it's having a really great website. It's being present where consumers are. So, we've said it, online marketplaces are a top source of information for consumers. And more importantly for dealers, it's ensuring that you have the right tools to be able to facilitate online sales for consumers. AutoTrader, we have the complimentary remote selling suite available for dealers. So, facilitating those online to offline activities. And we also offer digital retailing, again, to give consumers choice when they're shopping, so they can choose what elements of the purchase process they complete online versus those that are offline, because really you want to enable these consumers that are shopping for cars to be able to buy them right now.
Right, well, thank you so much, Lilian, for taking the time to do this interview. And as always, I wish you and your family good health and safety during this period.
Thank you so much, Karina.